Geta, the younger son of Septimius Severus and brother of Caracalla, was born into the height of imperial power, yet destined for a short and tragic reign. From the very beginning of his life, he lived under the shadow of others, his father, who built an empire through war and law, and his elder brother Caracalla, whose ambitious and aggressive nature constantly sought to overshadow him. Understanding the life and reign of Geta, though short, requires going back to his childhood within the Severan dynasty, where seeds of conflict between him and his brother were already sown. Born in 189 CE, Geta grew up in a world of military campaigns, courtly intrigue, and an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. His earliest years were shaped by the campaigns of his father, who often took his family with him to project the image of unity and dynastic continuity. Even as a boy, Geta was dressed in military garb, paraded before soldiers, and introduced as a rightful heir to Rome's throne, though always as the second in line after Caracalla. This secondary status would mark his life, as he was frequently portrayed as the quieter, more reserved, and perhaps more intellectual of the two brothers. When Septimius Severus rose to power in 193 CE, Geta was only a small child, but already he was given ceremonial roles within the imperial court. Coins were minted with his image alongside his brothers, projecting an image of dynastic harmony. Yet even these official symbols could not mask the rivalry brewing within the palace walls. Caracalla, older by a few years, was groomed more directly for leadership, often accompanying his father on military campaigns and receiving more praise from the legions. Geta, on the other hand, often remained behind with Julia Domna, their mother, who took on the role of educator and moral guide. Julia Domna herself was a remarkable figure, a Syrian noblewoman of strong intellect, known for her philosophical circles and involvement in governance. She tried to mediate between her two sons, but her efforts were continually undermined by their competing ambitions and incompatible personalities. By 198 CE, Severus formally elevated Caracalla to the rank of co-Augustus, making him joint emperor. This was a signal that Caracalla would one day inherit full power. Geta, meanwhile, remained a Caesar, a junior emperor, and though this was an honor, it was also a reminder that he was always second best. Over time, Severus did elevate Geta too, granting him the title of Augustus in 209 CE, creating the appearance of equal rule. Yet appearances were deceiving. The brothers shared the title of emperor, but not the reality of power. The empire was effectively divided between them, and their personal animosity prevented any real cooperation. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio describe a household that was essentially split in two, with Caracalla and Geta refusing to dine together, refusing to appear in public together, and even dividing the imperial palace with physical barriers. Their father, aware of this dangerous rivalry, attempted to hold them together by involving both sons in his campaigns. During the Caledonian campaign in Britain around 208 CE, Severus brought both Caracalla and Geta with him. He hoped that by sharing in the hardships of war, the brothers might learn to cooperate. Instead, the opposite happened. Caracalla attempted to assert dominance over the army and was reportedly caught plotting against his own father, or at least trying to hasten his death. Geta, meanwhile, remained more loyal, but he was constantly treated as the lesser figure. The tension between the brothers became so intense that the empire itself began to feel the strain. Severus, on his deathbed in 211 CE at Ebracum, modern-day York, famously advised his sons, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." It was advice born of desperation, as he knew that without unity between his heirs, Rome itself could face internal collapse. After Severus's death, Caracalla and Geta became joint rulers of the Roman Empire. For the first time, Geta had reached the pinnacle of power, sharing the throne as co-emperor. Yet the arrangement was doomed from the start. The animosity between the two was so severe that they could not live or govern together. According to several sources, they considered dividing the empire into two separate states, with Caracalla ruling the western provinces and Geta ruling the eastern. This radical idea was never implemented, but it shows how far the division between them had gone. Rome, however, could not easily be split in two, and the Senate, the army, and their mother all resisted such a drastic measure. For a brief period, Rome existed under a fragile balance. Caracalla and Geta held equal authority, and Geta began to gather his own supporters within the Senate and administration. He was seen by some as the more just and approachable of the two, more interested in civil matters than military glory. However, he lacked the brutal decisiveness of his brother, and in a world where power was secured through force, this was a fatal weakness. The tension escalated to the point where the palace became a dangerous battlefield of whispers, plots, and assassination attempts. Julia Domna found herself in an impossible role, trying to reconcile her sons while preventing bloodshed. The breaking point would soon come, but in these first months of joint rule, Geta's reign reveals a glimpse of what might have been. If the two brothers had somehow managed to cooperate, Rome might have seen a period of balanced governance, with Caracalla focusing on the military and Geta on civil administration. Instead, what unfolded was a tale of rivalry, betrayal, and fratricide that would forever mark the Severan dynasty. The first part of Geta's story, then, is not only about his rise, but also about the inevitable clash that awaited him, a clash that would end not only his reign, but also his life. Geta's story in the years 210 and 211 CE reveals the intensity of rivalry, distrust, and the calculated maneuvers that took place within the Severan dynasty. After the brief overview of his early background and the setting of Septimius Severus' final years, the conflict between the brothers came into sharper focus. While Severus envisioned both sons as joint heirs to maintain dynastic stability, the very structure of this dual arrangement created fertile ground for discord. In Roman imperial tradition, power sharing was an uneasy concept. The Republic had long relied on the principle of collegial offices to consuls, for instance, but the empire was not built for two emperors with equal authority. The Roman system functioned best when a single figure, the princeps or imperator, held supreme command. With Geta and Caracalla poised to inherit the throne together, contradictions emerged immediately. The character differences between Geta and Caracalla exacerbated these tensions. Contemporary sources, particularly Cassius Dio, emphasize Caracalla's violent and domineering nature, while portraying Geta as more reserved, cautious, and somewhat refined. Herodian adds that Geta preferred leisure, culture, and the pleasures of urban life, whereas Caracalla gravitated toward the army, hunting, and displays of martial toughness. These differences not only distinguished their personalities, but also foreshadowed the constituencies they would attract within Roman society. Caracalla, like his father, won support among the legions through boldness and promises of reward. Geta, meanwhile, drew sympathy from senators, intellectuals, and the cultural elite of Rome, who found his demeanor less threatening. This division of identity mirrored the deeper structural divides within the empire: the military versus the civilian elite, provincial soldiers versus Italian aristocrats, brute force versus cultivated tradition. The seeds of rivalry were already visible in Britain during Severus' last campaign. The emperor, physically weakened and often confined to a litter, relied on his sons for much of the administrative and ceremonial burden of rule. Yet instead of working as partners, Geta and Caracalla quarreled constantly, even over the simplest duties. Dio reports that the brothers rarely spoke directly to each other, using intermediaries even in matters of governance. Their entourages grew into rival courts within the imperial household, each faction jockeying for influence. Soldiers observed the tension, and so did civilian officials. The rift was impossible to ignore, and it cast doubt over whether the Severan dynasty could maintain unity after Severus' death. The emperor himself recognized the problem. His famous deathbed advice, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others," is telling. Severus knew that harmony between the brothers was unlikely, so he urged them at least to secure the loyalty of the army, which was the ultimate arbiter of power in the Roman world. For Geta, this advice was both a warning and a burden. He lacked the same natural rapport with soldiers that Caracalla enjoyed. While Caracalla would march, eat, and sleep alongside his men, adopting their rough manners, Geta seemed more detached. To balance this, Geta attempted to project imperial authority through administration, legal work, and displays of refinement in governance. Yet in the culture of the early 3rd century, where military loyalty mattered above all else, this strategy placed him at a disadvantage. When Severus died in February 211 CE at Ebracum, the imperial succession passed jointly to Caracalla and Geta. They were co-Augusti, co-emperors, equal in formal title. This moment represented the culmination of Severus' vision of dynastic stability. 2 sons carrying the empire forward together. Yet within weeks, the relationship deteriorated. The brothers returned from Britain to Rome, accompanied by the imperial guard and their respective entourages, and the city became the stage for a bitter experiment in divided rule. Palaces, councils, and even ceremonies were split between the 2 brothers. According to Herodian, they avoided each other so completely that they attempted to divide the imperial palace itself, constructing separate apartments and entrances to prevent accidental encounters. The shared empire was a fiction. In reality, it was being carved into 2 spheres of influence, with Rome itself caught in the middle. One of the most striking episodes of this rivalry concerned the idea of physically dividing the Roman Empire. Sources report that Caracalla and Geta considered splitting the empire into 2 parts, Caracalla ruling the west and Geta ruling the east. The proposal mirrored earlier divisions during the Roman Republic's civil wars, where rivals like Antony and Octavian carved out spheres of power. For Geta, the east was an attractive prospect. It was wealthier, more urbanized, and culturally sophisticated, aligning with his own interests and style of leadership. Alexandria, Antioch, and the great cities of Asia Minor could provide the intellectual and administrative environment he preferred. Caracalla, on the other hand, was inclined toward the west, with its strong military traditions and frontier defenses. Yet this proposal was radical, almost unthinkable to many Romans, who still cherished the ideal of a unified empire under a single imperator. The Senate, in particular, opposed the idea, fearing it would destroy the empire's coherence and unleash civil war. The army, too, was divided, since it could not easily accept loyalty to 2 rival emperors without inevitable conflict. Ultimately, the plan was abandoned, but the fact that it was seriously discussed shows how desperate the situation had become. During this fragile arrangement, Geta tried to build his own base of legitimacy. He emphasized his role as co-emperor, issuing coins and inscriptions that portrayed him with the same authority as Caracalla. He participated in public ceremonies, distributed donatives, and attempted to present himself as a legitimate, independent ruler. His coinage often stressed virtues like concordia, harmony, pietas, piety, and liberalitas, generosity, an ironic reflection of the discord that plagued his relationship with his brother. Through these images, Geta sought to appeal not only to the Roman people, but also to the Senate, projecting himself as the more cultured and traditional alternative to Caracalla's harsh militarism. The Senate, weary of Caracalla's brutality, likely saw in Geta a preferable option, though they knew that open favoritism could provoke violence. The rivalry between the brothers escalated in both subtle and dramatic ways. One infamous episode described by ancient writers involves a supposed plot by Caracalla to murder Geta during a gladiatorial show. According to this story, Caracalla had planned to have his soldiers fall upon Geta amid the chaos of the arena, disguising the assassination as an accident of public disorder. The plan failed, or at least was abandoned, but it illustrates the degree of animosity between the brothers. Geta himself was not passive. He too likely considered ways to secure sole power, though sources tend to frame him as more defensive, less aggressive than Caracalla. Nevertheless, both brothers were locked in a zero-sum contest. Only one could ultimately rule Rome. For the Roman populace, the rivalry was disorienting. Two emperors issuing decrees, presiding over ceremonies, and representing the state created confusion and instability. For the soldiers, loyalty was tested, as each emperor offered incentives and favors to secure allegiance. For senators, courtiers, and provincial governors, the situation was perilous. Choosing the wrong brother could mean political ruin or death. Many officials tried to balance their loyalties, but the strain of divided rule was unsustainable. In practice, the empire could not function with two equal emperors who hated each other. This period also reveals something important about Geta's political style. Though overshadowed by Caracalla in later memory, Geta demonstrated administrative competence and a commitment to maintaining traditional Roman values. His short reign as co-emperor shows signs of an attempt to stabilize governance through legal reforms and attention to civic life. Some surviving inscriptions and papyri suggest that Geta was involved in the appointment of officials and the oversight of provincial administration, though the details are scarce. Unlike Caracalla, who openly cultivated the army, Geta sought legitimacy through the structures of Roman governance, aligning himself with the Senate and urban elites. This strategy, however, made him vulnerable, as the Senate lacked the power to defend him against the military might that Caracalla controlled. By late 211 CE, the rivalry reached its breaking point. Both brothers realized that coexistence was impossible. Caracalla, more ruthless and decisive, began to plan his brother's elimination. Geta, though aware of the danger, continued to rely on legal authority, senatorial support, and the hope that tradition might shield him. He underestimated the degree to which violence had become the defining logic of imperial politics. When the decisive blow came in December 211, it was swift and merciless. Geta would be lured into a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation, only to be murdered in his mother Julia Domna's arms. That story belongs to the final act of his life, but in the months leading up to it, the fatal trajectory was already clear. Thus, in part 2 of Geta's story, we see the transformation from a promising young co-emperor to a trapped figure within a dynastic rivalry he could not escape. The Roman Empire, stretched between the authority of two brothers, revealed the structural impossibility of shared rule at this stage of history. Geta, despite his talents and appeal to the senatorial elite, was fighting a battle against the very logic of imperial power, which rewarded military dominance above all. His reliance on tradition, culture, and administration could not balance Caracalla's control of the army. The tragedy of Geta was not only that he died young, but also that his style of leadership, though potentially stabilizing, had no chance in the brutal world of 3rd century imperial politics. The stage was set for his downfall, and the empire braced itself for another wave of bloodshed. Geta's short reign, shared uneasily with his elder brother Caracalla, represents one of the most tragic episodes of dynastic conflict in Roman imperial history. To understand the depth of this tragedy, one must first grasp the context of his upbringing, his political challenges, and the bitter fraternal rivalry that would culminate in his untimely murder. In this phase of the story, we must explore not only the outward events that shaped Geta's final years, but also the psychological and political dynamics that made reconciliation between the two brothers impossible. This period was charged with tension, duplicity, and the constant threat of violence, and it ended in a shocking act of betrayal that reverberated throughout the empire. When Septimius Severus died in 211 CE, At Eberacum, modern York, England, he left behind a carefully constructed plan to secure his dynasty. He had raised both of his sons, Caracalla and Geta, to rule jointly after his death, perhaps inspired by earlier co-emperorships like that of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. However, unlike that harmonious partnership, the Severan brothers harbored intense hatred for one another. Their personalities were diametrically opposed. Caracalla was hot-tempered, aggressive, and deeply militaristic, while Geta was more reserved, intellectual, and inclined toward administrative governance. Their father in his final moments reportedly urged them to be good to each other, enrich the soldiers, and scorn everyone else. Advice that reflected both the reality of Roman power politics and his hope that their differences could be reconciled. Unfortunately, his words would be ignored. The rivalry between Caracalla and Geta erupted almost immediately after Severus' death. The imperial household, long aware of their enmity, became a battlefield of intrigue. Both brothers attempted to consolidate their own supporters within the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and among the provincial elites. The palace in Rome, where they both resided, became a site of daily confrontation. Ancient sources describe how the two brothers divided the imperial residence, each occupying separate sections with their own servants, guards, and advisors, while avoiding each other as much as possible. Meals were taken separately, and even the most routine administrative matters became subjects of dispute. The emperor's court, once a center of unity under Septimius Severus, descended into paralysis as the empire's leaders were forced to choose between the rival heirs. Tensions reached such a point that a shocking proposal was entertained: the division of the Roman Empire itself. Both Caracalla and Geta considered ruling different halves of the empire, with Caracalla perhaps controlling the western provinces and Geta governing the eastern territories. This idea, though extraordinary, reflected the deep hostility between them. Some senators and advisors supported this plan, believing it would prevent civil war. However, their mother, Julia Domna, strongly opposed the division. Julia, a powerful and intelligent woman, understood that dividing the empire would undermine Roman unity, weaken its military power, and create a precedent for fragmentation. She implored her sons to reconcile, using her influence and authority to maintain a fragile peace. Yet her efforts only delayed the inevitable. Caracalla, increasingly paranoid and ambitious, began to plot against his brother. He recognized that as long as Geta lived, his own authority would be challenged. Geta, on the other hand, relied heavily on the support of his mother and certain senators, but he underestimated the ruthlessness of his sibling. Ancient historians describe the atmosphere in Rome during these months as one of dread. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect both emperors, became a decisive factor, for their loyalty could determine the outcome of any conflict. Caracalla, who had long cultivated close ties with the military, had the advantage. The turning point came in December 211 C. Caracalla arranged a supposed reconciliation meeting within the palace, inviting Geta to meet with him in their mother Julia Domna's private quarters. Believing, or at least hoping, that a truce could be achieved under their mother's mediation, Geta accepted the invitation. However, it was a trap. As soon as Geta entered the chamber, Caracalla's soldiers rushed forward and attacked. Julia Domna, horrified, attempted to shield her younger son, but the guards cut him down in her arms. Geta, still a young man not yet in his 20s, died in a pool of blood, his mother weeping over his body. This brutal act not only shattered the Severan household, but also shocked the Roman elite. After Geta's assassination, Caracalla moved swiftly to eliminate all potential supporters of his brother. What followed was one of the most infamous purges in Roman history, remembered as the damnatio memoriae of Geta. Caracalla ordered Geta's name to be erased from inscriptions, his statues destroyed or defaced, and his image removed from coins and monuments. Anyone suspected of mourning Geta or expressing loyalty to him was executed. Ancient sources claim that as many as 20,000 people, including senators, equestrians, and even ordinary citizens, were put to death in the aftermath. This purge ensured that Caracalla would face no immediate opposition, but it also left deep scars on Roman society. The eradication of Geta's memory highlights the Roman practice of controlling history through destruction and erasure. Though Caracalla tried to wipe out all traces of his brother, fragments of Geta's legacy survived. Coins bearing his image, inscriptions hidden from destruction, and the accounts of historians all preserve the memory of the ill-fated co-emperor. These remnants remind us of the fragility of power and the tragic cost of dynastic rivalry. Julia Domna's grief following Geta's death must also be considered. Forced to continue serving as Caracalla's advisor and empress, she endured the unbearable pain of knowing her elder son had murdered her younger son in her presence. Julia's role as peacemaker had failed, and yet her political influence remained vital for the stability of the regime. Her position embodied the cruel paradox of Roman imperial politics. Personal tragedy was often inseparable from the exercise of power. In reflecting upon Geta's fate, historians have long debated what might have happened if he had survived. Would the empire have been stronger under two rulers, balancing each other's qualities? Could Geta's more moderate and administrative style of leadership have brought stability to Rome? Or would civil war have torn the empire apart, regardless of Julia Domna's efforts? These questions remain speculative, but they emphasize the tragic potential that was lost with Geta's murder. Thus, the story of Geta's final years is one of betrayal, fraternal conflict, and the destructive pursuit of absolute power. Though his reign was brief and overshadowed by his brother's violence, Geta's life and death reveal the darker realities of dynastic politics in the Roman Empire. His story serves as a cautionary tale of how familial hatred, left unchecked, can unravel the stability of even the greatest of empires, leaving behind only grief, bloodshed, and a legacy carved in erasure. After the death of Septimius Severus in February 211 CE, the Roman Empire passed into the hands of his two sons, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known to history as Caracalla, and Publius Septimius Geta. For nearly 2 years before their father's passing, the brothers had shared in imperial titles and honors, but the fragile arrangement could not conceal the deep animosity that simmered between them. While Severus had hoped to maintain unity within the Severan dynasty, urging his sons on his deathbed to live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others, the reality was that Geta and Caracalla could scarcely tolerate each other's presence. The empire they inherited was strong in some ways and vulnerable in others. The frontiers were secure for the moment, thanks to Severus' military reforms and campaigns. Yet the financial cost of maintaining such a vast army placed constant pressure on the treasury. Rome's aristocracy had been sidelined during Severus' reign, and although the Senate still met and conducted formalities, true power lay with the military and the imperial household. Into this atmosphere of strained resources and military dominance stepped two young emperors who despised one another and were forced to rule jointly. Geta, the younger of the two brothers, was by most accounts of a milder disposition. Ancient sources portray him as bookish, fond of literature and philosophy, and perhaps more inclined toward the life of a cultured statesman than a soldier. He had been elevated to the rank of Augustus in 209 CE, sharing imperial power with both his father and Caracalla. During Severus' last campaign in Britain, Geta had been left in York, Ebracum, to manage civil affairs, while Severus and Caracalla led the army into Caledonia. This division of responsibilities foreshadowed the later years of his life, when his role seemed more administrative and ceremonial compared to Caracalla's harsh and militaristic character. Caracalla, by contrast, embodied the image of a soldier emperor. He was impulsive, violent, and deeply ambitious. From an early age, he had shown a tendency toward cruelty, and Severus himself was not blind to his elder son's nature. Yet Caracalla was the firstborn, and thus he always regarded Geta as an unwanted rival for imperial authority. This rivalry intensified after Severus' death, when both sons became sole rulers of the empire in name but divided in practice. The early months of their joint reign were marked by bitter disputes. The brothers could not agree on policies, appointments, or even ceremonial duties. Ancient historians such as Cassius Dio and Herodian provide dramatic accounts of their hostility. According to Dio, they divided the palace into two separate households, each with its own guards, servants, and advisors, so that they might avoid even accidental encounters. Meals were taken separately, entrances were guarded, and each emperor surrounded himself with loyal retainers. The household staff lived in constant fear of violence erupting between the two camps. The tension extended beyond the palace. In the administration of the empire, both emperors sought to secure loyalty from different groups. Caracalla courted the army, lavishing gifts and promising higher pay, in accordance with his father's advice to enrich the soldiers. Geta, meanwhile, attempted to win the favor of the Senate and the civilian population, presenting himself as the gentler, more cultured counterpart to his brother's brutality. This contrast, however, only deepened their mutual suspicion. Each feared that the other would seize sole power through assassination or political maneuvering. One of the most striking episodes of this period was the proposal, whether genuine or rumored, to divide the empire into two separate realms. The idea was not without precedent. The Roman world had occasionally been divided temporarily between co-rulers. According to Herodian, the brothers seriously contemplated a partition. Caracalla would take control of the western provinces, centered on Gaul and the legions along the Rhine, while Geta would govern the east with its wealthy cities and ancient traditions. Their mother, Julia Domna, who had been a powerful presence during Severus' reign, was horrified by the idea. She understood that a division of the empire would weaken Rome's global prestige and might invite civil war. With great difficulty, she persuaded her sons to abandon the plan. Yet the fact that they had considered it at all revealed the depth of their enmity. Rumors of plots circulated constantly. Both brothers increased their bodyguards, and both avoided appearing together in public whenever possible. When official duties forced them to attend ceremonies side by side, whether in the Senate, at religious festivals, or in the games, they stood stiffly, refusing to acknowledge each other. Some favored Caracalla for his strength and military leadership. Others sympathized with Geta, who seemed more humane. As Augusta, she was respected throughout the empire, and both sons relied on her to mediate disputes. Her intelligence and political acumen were well known. She sponsored philosophers, jurists, and artists, and her presence gave a certain dignity to the imperial household. Yet even she could not reconcile her sons. The constant quarrels wore her down, and she feared for the stability of the dynasty that her husband had built so carefully. Caracalla, who had always viewed Geta as a threat, began to plot openly against him. He may have feared that Geta, by aligning himself with the Senate and civilians, would undermine his dominance over the military. Moreover, the possibility that Geta could one day father heirs of his own meant that the Severan dynasty might fracture permanently. Accounts of the final conspiracy vary, but most agree that Caracalla devised a plan under the guise of reconciliation. He persuaded Julia Domna to arrange a meeting between the two brothers in her private apartments within the imperial palace. The idea was to present an image of unity to the world, a last attempt to settle their differences in the presence of their mother. Geta, though wary, agreed to attend, perhaps out of respect for Julia, or perhaps because he underestimated the danger. He entered the chamber unarmed, expecting a private family discussion. As Geta stepped into the room, Caracalla's soldiers hidden in advance fell upon him. Julia Domna, in a desperate attempt to protect her son, threw herself around him, yet the assassins were relentless. Geta was stabbed repeatedly, his blood spilling over Julia's clothing as she wept and cried out. Cassius Dio describes the scene in vivid detail, noting that Julia was left drenched in her son's blood, wailing as Caracalla stood by without remorse. The murder of Geta took place in December 211 CE, less than a year after the death of their father. Geta was only 22 years old. His death ended the brief experiment of joint rule and left Caracalla as sole emperor. But the killing was not the end of the story. It was followed by one of the most brutal purges in Roman history. Thousands of Geta's supporters, friends, and even ordinary citizens suspected of sympathizing with him were executed. This included senators, equestrians, and members of the palace staff. The purge instilled terror throughout Rome and ensured that no rival faction could rise to challenge Caracalla's rule. Julia Domna, though devastated by the murder of her son, was forced to remain loyal to Caracalla, as her own survival depended on it. His statues were destroyed or defaced, his name was chiseled out of inscriptions, and coins bearing his image were recalled or defaced. Only a few surviving monuments and scattered literary references preserve his memory today. The very effort to suppress his name highlighted the intensity of the hatred that Caracalla bore for him. Certain senators and intellectuals spoke quietly of his cultured personality, his interest in philosophy, and his potential as a more benevolent ruler than his brother. In the provinces, where official propaganda was less strictly enforced, coins and inscriptions bearing his name sometimes continued in circulation for years. To many, Geta became a symbol of lost potential, the young emperor who might have offered Rome a gentler path had he been allowed to rule. Septimius Severus had worked tirelessly to establish a stable dynasty, marrying military strength with provincial legitimacy through his Syrian wife, Julia Domna. Yet his hopes for a harmonious succession were undone by the personal rivalry of his sons. The empire was too vast, the power too absolute, for two ambitious young men to share without bloodshed. It solidified Caracalla's sole reign, which would be remembered for both cruelty and innovation. Caracalla's famous Constitutio Antoniniana, issued in 212 CE, extended Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, a measure that transformed the Roman world. Yet his reign was also stained by massacres, heavy taxation, and reckless military campaigns. Some later writers speculated that had Geta survived, Rome might have enjoyed a more balanced and humane governance. For Julia Domna, the murder of her son was a personal catastrophe, but she continued to play a vital role in imperial politics. She remained by Caracalla's side throughout his reign, acting as his advisor and maintaining her position as Augusta. A grief haunted her, even as she projected an image of dignity and authority to the outside world. Thus ended the life of Publius Septimius Geta, co-emperor of Rome for a brief, turbulent span. The fragments of his memory that survived scraps of text, altered inscriptions, damaged coins stand as a testament to both the power of Rome's emperors to shape history and the futility of trying to erase it completely. Geta's fate reminds us of the human cost of imperial ambition, where even the bonds of family offer no protection against the hunger for absolute power.